Good evening and welcome back to the reading room presented by Craftsmen Online. My name is Worshipful Brother Michael Arce, and I'll be serving as the digital Tyler for this evening's presentation. A quick reminder, you have entered a Zoom meeting that is being recorded for playback on our YouTube channel and also on a future Craftsmen Online podcast episode that you're free to share with your brothers and friends and those that have an interest in Freemasonry. A little bit about Craftsmen Online. We are a New York State initiative by brothers for brothers, connecting brethren with leadership development, Masonic education, and celebrating the unique history of New York Freemasonry, as well as the special men who have served and continue to serve our ancient and gentle craft. Before we begin with tonight's program, a quick reminder that the experiences, comments, and opinions, and also viewpoints that will be shared during this program are those of the individual Freemasons and those in attendance, and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, or Masonic authority. If now you'll please give your attention to the hosts of our reading room, as I'm happy to turn over the talking stick to Right Worshipful Bill Edwards and Brother Jason Short for this evening's program. My brothers.
Good evening. Very excited about tonight's reading room. We're going to be looking at, I'll hold up, this is a Jubilee edition. If it comes up, we'll see. Well, it's the Secret Teaching of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. And tonight we're going to be talking about the free symbolism of Freemasonry. And very excited about tonight's program. I'd like to welcome back our two guest panelists with us. We have Right Worshipful and illustrious Clifford Jacobs. Cliff was raised a Master Mason in 1998. He has served as Master of his lodge. He has been active in the Royal Arch Masons as well as the Scottish Rite. And in 2008, he received his 33rd and last degree of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite. And then Cliff has also received awards for his community service work. But here tonight, we're to get that aspect of Cliff where he is just an active student of Freemasonry, and I would say in life of general, and just really looking forward to bring your perspective to our conversation. So thank you for being here tonight. We have a new host tonight. We have Brother Joe Martinez. And first, I want to thank you for your service as a veteran. So thank you, Brother Joe, for that. Very much appreciated. I also want to call out that you're a doctoral candidate pursuing a PhD in biblical exposition. So very interesting indeed. You've also served as past master of your lodge. You're a member of the York Rite, Scottish Rite, and other Masonic bodies. And like all of us, you enjoy looking at the initiatic experience of Freemasonry and what is that deeper meaning and how we can apply it to ourselves. So again, thank you for joining us tonight as we look into the writings of Manly Hall and the secret teachings of all ages. Brother Jason, if you could give us some, how we're going to run the evening here, give us some tips.
Sure. So the rules for our reading room discussion are pretty straightforward. The panel will occur first, then participants can join in with any questions or comments. We'll limit everyone to one or two statements so that as many can participate as possible. This is not a tiled lodge, so please govern yourselves accordingly. And everyone's going to be put on mute except for our panelists, just so that anybody's background conversations or the dog doesn't distract from our evening of esoteric conversation. Brother Bill?
So with that, we can jump in with our discussion questions. I think you have the first question we're going to go after tonight.
Yeah. You know, Hall was made a Mason in 1954, but The Secret Teachings of All Ages was published in 1928 when Hall was only 27 years old. Brother Martinez, do you believe this chapter to be an accurate reflection of Freemasonic symbolism?
Well, that is a really loaded question there. So, yeah, number one, thank you for having me. And number two, um, one of the great parts of being on here tonight is that I am a big fan of Manly P. Hall. I did find his writings before I joined the craft, and I've always found them of interest. So I think after I joined the craft and started to actually look into more of the symbolism and the allegory that Freemasonry contains and is filled with, I did start to notice that illustrious Brother Hall, he was also a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason. I think he kind of hit the nail on the head on a lot of concepts that we understand as learned and esoteric Masons, that a lot of the craft seems to gloss over a lot of times. That's always one of my big pushes on my show, on the Masonic Roundtable, and when I present and things like that, is that there's so much symbolism and so much allegory and so much deeper meaning, and a lot of Masons just go through the motions and miss out on all of that, until they take the time and actually stop and look. But I think Brother Hall actually got a lot of things right. Now, there are some things he did uh, elaborate on that probably don't fit in the box of what we would call Freemasonry, but for the most part, we have to understand where Brother Hall lived, right? He lived in the time of the Theosophists and the people that were really tired of your boring green bean masonry, as I like to call it, right? This is before the age of fraternalism. This was the early 1900s, and he traveled the world and read and became really educated on initiation and being a seeker. And I think that's what he brings to our craft in the secret teachings of all ages.
Hmm. Uh, that's really well put, and thank you, Brother Joe, for being here. Your podcast with Brother RC on Craftsmen Online was great, as well as your Masonic Roundtable discussions. So it's really a pleasure to have your insight here. Brother Cliff, what do you think? Does Hall reflect Freemasonic symbolism here in a positive light?
I think he does. First, just a quick correction of my bio. I was actually raised in 1988, not 98. Um, I think I love Manly Hall, and I've read a lot of Manly Hall, and I do think he hits the nail on the head pretty much. The only place where I would probably disagree with him, I don't think that some of the things that he discusses, like the Dionysiac artificers, I don't think it was a forward progression so much where these concepts, evolved into Freemasonry. I think the speculative brothers reached back in time and then incorporated certain ideas into Freemasonry of their time. So I think they reached back and brought these concepts forward as opposed to some of the ideas evolving into Freemasonry.
Hmm.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I feel Hall does a great job here as well as in the Lost Keys, like we had covered in our prior reading room sessions, hitting the nail on the head, so to speak. However, I think that at least in our day and age, any brother of the craft who reads this chapter may feel a little bit of a misrepresentation or that it's misleading. I think a lot of focus of the symbolism of our craft is really the exoteric symbols, the plum, the square, the level, and so forth. But here, Hall is diving deeper into the the symbolism of the human proportion and how that bleeds into the spiritual temple and construction in general, um, which I find very fascinating. Uh, Hall also, though, draws some connections that I personally had a little bit of a hard time understanding. He puts a connection on the page between Freemasonry and the Order of Mevlevi, the Islamic dancing dervishes. He details a hierarchy of holy men who are admitted into intimate communion with deity within that Sufi tradition. And Cliff, I'm wondering, how do you think this parallels Freemasonry?
I wish I could quote him, a lot better, but the writer Idris Shah, who wrote a book called The Sufis, goes into great detail about the Sufi influence on Freemasonry. Again, I think some of the concepts were brought into Freemasonry by speculative Masons. But I think there's a lot to learn there because if you've ever seen the Mevlana dervishes and they're whirling, they're right hand is pointed towards heaven and their left hand is pointed towards the earth as they rotate. And so they receive with one hand that which is divine, and they are the conduit for bringing spirituality down into matter. And I like to think that that's what we as Masons try to do. We try to infuse the rather mundane world with spirituality, and we do that because we're the conduit. We work on ourselves, and then we bring that out into the world. So I can see that as a possible influence for Freemasonry for sure.
Hmm. Uh, Brother Bill, would you like to jump in with some quotes?
Sure. So the first is about Freemasonry's priceless heritage. And I'll quote a few lines from that section. The sanctum sanctorum of Freemasonry is ornamented with the Gnostic jewels of 1,000 ages. Its rituals ring with the divinely inspired words of seers and sages. And then he goes on to say Freemasonry is a worldwide university teaching the liberal arts and sciences of the soul to all who will hearken to its words. And then finally, he ends with realization that within Freemasonry's mysteries lie hidden the long lost arcana sought by all people since the genesis of human reason. So I guess my question is, do we think that within our teachings are of the liberal arts and sciences are of the soul for all that seek? Do we think it has that within its deeper meanings? So I'd like anyone that would like to react to that. What do they think?
Sure, I'll take that one because I truly I think this is one of Brother Hall's strong suits is that he brings a lot of different traditions in to kind of make the point that Freemasonry is an amalgamation of different traditions, right? There's no ancient Freemasonry that was carved on a stone 10,000 years ago and it's the exact same story that we tell today, right? It's changed and morphed over time, right? Us for the last 100 years, we've been accustomed to knowing that the allegories that we use, i.e., the Haramic legend, is all there ever was. But if you go back 20 years prior to that, there were so many different other allegories that were used, But again, we kind of look at this with monocles, where it's like, okay, this is masonry and it has to do with Hiram and the temple, but there were many other stories that used to convey the same teachings about understanding how to build our souls. So it really doesn't matter what allegory or story you use, as long as you're using a story that conveys a message about these are the ways in which you build your soul. And in that soul building, you make not only the really close space around you, but your general community a better place, or at least that's the goal.
I like to agree with that. Even looking back prior to the Hermetic legend that we're familiar with today, Freemasonry has taken on several different allegories. But some of the through line in all of it has been the preservation of the seven liberal arts and sciences, and looking through both the exoteric and the esoteric sense, the lesser mystery and the greater mystery of those. Um, the old charges and the old manuscripts that Hall seems to be basing a lot of his philosophy on, many of them contain kind of the legends of Freemasonry, which dates back to Adam and then the children of Lamech. And uh, a big part of the introduction of the liberal arts and sciences through several different lenses. Um, and ever since then, every iteration of that Masonic legend um, says the same thing, but a little bit different. But all of them lean into that the seven liberal arts and sciences worked to better humanity. One of my favorite legends and part of the old charges is that Euclid taught the seven liberal arts and sciences to a bunch of the children of the early empires who were without direction, essentially. the general population was unruly, and Euclid taught them then the 7 liberal arts and sciences, which created geometry, which created the craft of masonry and gave them purpose in their lives, as well as elevated them spiritually, I believe.
Well, if I could latch on to what you just said, I mean, I think I'm really interested in this chapter where Brother Hall talks about these early Masonic documents. I mean, there are no footnotes for these early Masonic documents. I mean, we all have heard the stories that he's talking about when it comes to Adam and the children of Seth. When he's talking about those things, we have copies of that in Anderson's Constitutions, right? And that's one that's been transposed and pushed forward and shows up in people's Ahiman Razones and their codes and constitutions, right? That's our legendary origin, right? Knowing that stuff is written for allegorical purposes more so than archaeological ones, right? But I think that you kind of touched on something really important where he really dives deep into the 7 liberal arts and sciences, and he tells us why they're important, right? I know that I'm a Virginia Mason. That's where my home lodge is, and I know a lot of you were New York Masons, but we all have a similar lecture when it comes to the fellowcraft degree. And this is normally when we hear about the 7 liberal arts and sciences. And at least in the jurisdictions that I'm a member in, we get this really cursory, high-level overview of these 7 liberal arts and sciences, and they aren't fleshed out in a lot of detail. And I think Manly Hall really dives into it and tells us, hey, there's a lot more meaning here, all the way back to Brother Jason's point that it's more than the physical, this is how I measure, this is how I build something. They have a deeper symbolic significance, and we should really latch on to that. So I think that's a great point.
I like the comment of the soul building. That resonated with me, right? That seems to be the lesson, and that we're builders of a temple and we are that temple. And how do we take all of this information and I like Cliff, I also agree with that idea that they reached back and pulled forward as opposed to it being this stream just sort of rolling through time and then we eventually got it today. Or maybe it's a little bit of both. I'm still in my own kind of looking at things. There's always the idea of unseen hands helping things happen. So maybe it's a little bit of an unseen hand helping to push a certain current through, and then those that resonate with that current reach out and bring that forward or some combination thereof. But I think there's that idea of building ourselves and how do we get better, and then as we improve ourselves, as was said, we improve society. And the value of masonry is that in the second quote that I'll reference is that we is considering that Freemasonry is a tree, the roots of which spread through so many soils. It follows the traces thereof must be found in its fruit, that its language and ritual should retain much of the various sects and institutions it has passed through before arriving at its present state. And in Masonry, we meet the Indian, the Egyptian, the Jewish, and the Christian ideas, terms therefrom the supreme ambition of their craft and symbols. So however it ended up there, whether it pushed itself forward, we reached back, or a combination thereof, I think it does speak to that universalism I personally resonate with. And what do you think, Cliff, about that?
Well, it's interesting. One of the, I hope I'm not giving anything away, but in the presentation of the working tools in the fellowcraft degree, we eventually come to that phrase, we're traveling to that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. And when you look at it in the ritual book, it's set off in quotation marks. So that means it's taken from someplace else. And the place that it's taken from is Shakespeare's Hamlet. That's part of the to be or not to be speech. And that comes up in Hamlet. So that's a perfect indication that we do reach back and we take from other things, because that quote is not strictly Masonic, it's Shakespearean.
Very interesting. I think one of the things that's interesting
can I
is
comment on?
When Hall started talking, he mentions the Tower of Babel, and specifically, how that was. If we look at the early rituals of the late 1600s, it did reference the Tower of Babel and the Noachites and so forth. And then I think where we look at the social influence around that time, there was Solomon's Temple spiritualized, was very popular. And again, looking at then how even culture can potentially influence how we adapt and adjust our symbols. And I've often speculated that could be the reason why there was that shift from the Tower of Babel perspective to a Solomon's Temple perspective in our ritual. So again,
I've noticed like a pattern though in the presentation, because in the old texts that Hall's referring to, the building of the Tower of Babel is like the first instance of masonry being a craft, and but surrounding that, there's this generational thing where like Lamech is, I think, the third generation away from Adam. So his great grandfather is Adam, and then for the great uh, Herman, whose father is Cush, and his grandfather is Shem. His great grandfather is Noah, and so then there's this other again like this 3-time generational leap. When we look at the allegory of King Solomon's temple, and we're presented with Solomon, who is the son of David, who is the son of I'm grasping of I wish son of David, who is the son of, I can't remember his name, who Jesse, thank you, our biblical expert, who is the son of Boaz, who plays a major role for anybody who's initiated in the craft. And we see again this pattern emerging of like these 3 generations. And in each one of these allegories that's presented around the building of the Tower of Babylon, up to the building of King Solomon's temple, we see this presented. And so I wonder, when the speculative brothers who laid the plans for our current allegory and its designs, were they leaning into this relationship as well?
Brother Joe, do you have any thoughts on the topic? Unless, Cliff, if you were going to say something.
Yeah, just a comment. I mean, once upon a time, didn't we refer to ourselves not as Masons but Noachites?
Yes.
And that the whole legend of Noah and the flood was the sort of the central motif in Freemasonry, as opposed to the building of Solomon's temple, and that came later. I think that's my understanding
Yes,
of.
it is. Yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just to latch onto that, Brother Cliff. So that was another when we came to around the time in the early 18th century where the 2 degrees were broken off into 3, and we start to see our Master Mason degree. That was an alternate allegory that was used alongside the legend of Hiram. So you had the legend of Noah and his 3 sons, and you had Hiram, and they were worked in different lodges. So you could be a Mason in London and go right across the street to another lodge, and you'd see a completely different raising allegory. But they were contemporary until such time as, there were splits between the ancients and the moderns, and then they all got back together. But the legend of Hiram kind of solidified around the 1720s.
Brother Bill, let's ask illustrious brother Michael Araco's question. What are your thoughts on the institution that the Dionysic architects and Pythagoreans constructed buildings to impress mental attitudes, attuning vibrations from the invisible world? Keep in mind, Winston Churchill said, "We build our houses and our houses build us." Cliff, do you have any comment?
I like that idea a lot. Just from personal experiences, when I've traveled through Europe and visited a lot of cathedrals, a lot of them are built over sacred sites. Some of them were sites that were used by Druids once upon a time. And a lot of them are built over underground wells or streams. So I think the whole idea is that when you entered the cathedral in this instance, that it something spiritual was supposed to happen. I remember when I went to Chartres Cathedral in France, and as you approach it, from the different streets, you can barely see the entire structure. And it's not until you step into the plaza that you are kind of overwhelmed with the magnificence of the structure. So I think it was supposed to have a um, a very deep emotional impact on the pilgrim who was traveling there. And I just kind of to bring in one of my favorite quotes from this article that we had to read. It says Freemasonry within a temple of stone cannot be other than speculative, but Freemasonry within the living temple of the body is operative. And so it makes me think about when we are performing our degrees. We meet in a place that is representative of King Solomon's temple. We're already there. However, during the course of our degrees, we form another temple within the temple made up of living bodies, brothers who form the walls of this sort of temple within a temple. So why do we do that? Why is there a need for this second temple when we're already in a temple? And I think that's where the to use for lack of a better word, that's where the magic happens.
Yes.
Not in the physical space that we're occupying, but when we recreate this temple made up of our bodies. And I think that's where things happen. So I like the idea that the spiritual structure is supposed to instill us with a deeper, more resonant type of feeling.
So I'll throw this out from my own experience, adding on to Brother Cliff. I stood in different places in that temple and had different experiences. So if one wants to ground themselves through meditation or whatever that technique may be, just stay. I encourage brothers, just stand in different places, be a corner, be by the candidate with the obligation, and just sense the different feelings that you get from that experience. And I found them to be quite profound and moving beyond just the ritual itself. So I would encourage any brother listening to consider that as a way for it to be more than just a physical space that is created.
Brother Joe, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, going back to your question, I think he really does make some interesting points when it comes to the Dionysian artificers and that whole story that he's trying to put forward. And I think Brother Cliff hit it on the head, where there was so much to the sacred geometry of Gothic cathedral building that we as a society don't even think or learn about it anymore. You get maybe like 1 or 2 pages of it during the Middle Ages in history class, but sacred geometry was a really big deal when they were cathedral building. Whether it was Notre Dame or Rosslyn Chapel, any of those styles of buildings were built in a very particular way for a very particular purpose, and that was to bring you closer to your idea of divinity when you walked in. And there's so much to say about Gothic architecture, and I know I don't know if you've had him on, Right Worshipful Brother Ryan Flynn, the Masonic artist. He does a phenomenal presentation on sacred geometry and architecture. I would definitely reach out to him. He is super fascinating to listen to, but he shows you how there's so much to see in Gothic architecture when it comes to speculative Freemasonry that it's shocking, and you never really notice it the very first time.
It's like the golden ratio, as they call it, is incorporated into a lot of these structures, and the golden ratio is sometimes referred to as God's equation. So they built that into the structures.
And that's Paul kind of gets into that a bit with Vitruvius's Illustrated Man and his sections on the macrocosm and the microcosm, going back to the proportions of the human body, which to these architects, these ancient architects, were understanding those proportions, were being able to understand the proportions in nature and acquainting ourselves with the proportions of nature. We're able to find the harmonics that exist in life, harmonics that exist within ourselves, and harmonics that exist in things that we construct as well. I like the passage where Hall speaks of like the Oracle of Delphi or the Ark of the Covenant. These were oracles not only as a sense of where they what they were housing, but they in themselves, the construction of them was based on the proportions of the human, was based on the proportions of a living thing. And so if those proportions were tuned in correctly, then this became a living entity that had a lifespan for generations.
Mm.
Actually, interesting that you say that, and that's some pretty deep information because it was something I was reading a while back. I don't know if you guys can hear me. I'm sorry if I just jumped in and started talking. I don't know if that was like allowed, but it
Oh,
was some.
Actually, we're going to get to participant involvement here in about 5 minutes. So if you just want to wait till then, that would be great. Thank you, brother. So I think let's have a fun one from Brother Larocco, who couldn't be here tonight, and extends his best wishes to everyone. So what are your thoughts on Solomon, the spirit of the universal illumination? And he talked about that, Sol Amen, and Solomon, the Kabbalist, alchemist, and necromancer. McGregor Mathers said King Solomon was a magician in the fullest sense. So both a interpretation of Solomon being universal and the spirit of universal the spirit of universal illumination, as well as him then being a actual magician in the fullest sense. Brother Cliff or Brother Joe, do you have any reaction to that?
Well, so I probably differ with Brother Hall on the opinion of that, especially when it comes to he's pulling so much from a lot of the people that were really prominent during the age of theosophy, right? This is when the age of theosophy was starting to dwindle, right? But you mentioned McGregor Mathers. Very prominent Freemason, was big in the SRIA, and then broke off from Freemasonry to start the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, right? So this is about the time where you see a bunch of really learned Masons who need to go elsewhere to do something to practice their Masonry, right? So they're leaving the craft and then starting all these other things. So it's interesting that he uses him as a reference point, but again, we have a much different opinion in general of McGregor Mathers now than they did in the 1920s when this was written. So, I take that with a grain of salt. But, I think that to that point, there were people at the time that, and I know other writings of Manly P. Hall talk about this, Initiates of the Flame and Lost Keys, which I think y'all have discussed here. Talk about injecting things into Freemasonry that are not Freemasonry, and he'll highlight that in very clear language in certain places. So yeah, so that's my 2 cents on McGregor Mathers.
Okay, Brother Cliff.
Yeah, the clavicles of Solomon, at least they're attributed to him, are very powerful texts. Excuse me. And was he the originator of that form of magic? I don't know if it could be traced back directly to him. But it is very efficacious, and so it's not something to be played with or taken lightly. And just a side comment, I think in reading Manly Hall's text, I kind of approached it like I'm in Joseph Campbell territory, as opposed to some actual historical record. I think it's Masonic mythology as opposed to actual Masonic history.
Well,
I really
said.
like that. That's really well put, Cliff. Masonic mythology. Um, I'm gonna dwell on that now. So the name Manley says the name Solomon may be divided into the three syllables, and this is something he touches on in Lost Keys as well. Sol, on, symbolizing light, glory, and truth collectively and respectively. So as the spirit of universal illumination through the sense of the symbol that Solomon represents throughout um, the the scriptural texts. I think he does um, reflect that. I think he is supposed to be the allegory of that. As far as the grimoire traditions, or like the later tradition that attributes him to being a necromancer, an alchemist, kabbalist, uh, I don't know. I think a lot of that is prescribed to him in kind of the maybe um, in a much more modern time. I know that he and Brother Joe, I'm sure you could comment on this a little bit better, but he did perform exorcisms uh, that happened not just there, but several times throughout those texts, and was something revered as a miracle, as magical. But getting into the practical sense of Solomon as far as Freemasonry is concerned, I think I think it just comes down to what the personal relationship that brother has with their sacred book of law. And that there is a different Solomon that's represented in different texts that are out there.
No, I absolutely see that point. And to your point, Solomon is prominent in all three of the Abrahamic faiths, right? The Quran talks about King Solomon a lot, especially when it comes to the more mystical aspects of Solomon. You find that there. You find it in the Talmud. Much more so than you find in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. But yeah, no, I think that's spot on. And I also think that going all the way back to what Brother Clifford said, I think the thing we need to remember is that Solomon is an archetype. Going, to Brother Cliff's point about archetypes and Campbell and the concept of a monomyth. I think this entire book is one big love letter to the monomyth, right? This primal story that we have, and that if you choose to be that seeker and walk that path, there is a path to enlightenment for you, and that enlightenment looks a little bit different for each and every person. But yeah, to your point, I think Solomon is very prominent. And it's interesting. I never thought about what you just said. What do people and their individual faiths bring into or inject into their idea of King Solomon, right? Where at its very surface, it's you have three archetypes, right? The three Grand Masters are different archetypes that we can then pull symbolism from. But I never thought about it like that. What are people bringing into the idea of Solomon from their own faith or background system?
Yeah, because for like the Talmudic Jews didn't emerge until what 600 around 600 AD. Am I correct in that? So right there, you already have an anachronism in tying him into the historical sense of Solomon, and two completely different tracks that may run parallel for one for Judaism, but don't necessarily complement the Christian or the Islamic faiths and their and then the Theosophic tradition.
Well, I mean, to that point, there are different versions of the. If we're going to talk about the Talmud, there's different version. There was a version of the Talmud when the Jews were in exile, right, in Babylon. So there's been many living, breathing documents that encompass the Talmud, which is basically all the things that are not contained in Scripture, right? And some of those volumes are ridiculous in terms of how much was written and what was written about things. It's amazing how much they wrote. But there's been different flavors and versions over time. But there are versions of the Talmud. Now, to your point, how many of them talk about Kabbalah and Solomon and things like that? That I couldn't answer right off the bat. But I'm sure it's more prominent in the later post-CE versions than they are in the BCE versions.
So I think we're to the point where if we want to open it up for a few questions for about 10 minutes, and then that would bring us to wrapping up the evening. So if anyone would like to put in chat or raise their hand, and then our moderator will help opening you up for a question. Brother Pips, I think you wanted to make a comment. Would you like to do so now?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry about that earlier. I thought it was more of an open forum, but something that Jason said to me earlier. Said earlier in the Zoom that struck a chord in me because I read something a while back, and it was saying that the columns that are in churches represent the members. So if you look at some of the columns that are more curvy at the bottom, they represent the women members, and the columns that are more straight represent the men members. So I thought that was pretty cool how you made that connection. How the things that are in our everyday world may represent us as people.
Yeah, there's actually in I think it's in Pike's Book of the Words. He has a very great part where he discusses the phallus and that as a architectural symbol that I recommend Andrew you check out.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I think Brother Cobb wanted to make a comment. So if you want to.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh yeah, I kind of started rereading the book, and a couple chapters earlier, he talks about cryptography and symbolism, and after he, like we were talking about with his etymologizing of Solomon, and kind of deriving, like, I think the sun from that. Like, I think that it's a legal move to derive some solar representation in Enoch with and so I felt like, yeah, there are a lot of that kind of reading mix up is occurs a few times in Hall's reading, but I also wondered if that was like part of his method for mythologizing or building up a new veil for like his impression of the secret.
If I understand your question, Brother Cobb, you're asking if Hall's interpretation of the Masonic myth is based on the multiple sources that he's pulling on, and he's speculating on a singular conclusion, or
it's like or I wonder if like he had his own impression of what like every he has his own impression of the monomyth, and then he feels like he might be able to use more familiar signs in like a more estranged or weird way.
I understand.
Get that across, like by turning Solomon into like a solar sign. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand now. Well, Brother Martinez and I were briefly talking on this point yesterday. Brother Joe, do you want to speak towards this?
I was going to wait and see where you went with it. So go ahead.
I think that Hall early on in his life achieved a level of understanding, and he had this ability to see distinctive patterns throughout cultures and associate a monomyth, which he was able to then understand through his own deeper wisdom. So I think a lot of the philosophical approach that Hall takes towards his understanding and his teachings comes from a very simplified understanding of the whole mechanism. And it's finding that truth in life that many of us, I think, are seeking. It's finding that reintegration of the soul, or finding that access to the Akashic record, or what have you, the collective unconscious. But there is a doorway that you pass through, which Brother Bill is great to speak on that. But there is this threshold that I think Hall passed through when he was young that allowed him to see the underlying connection that runs through many things. And that's why when he speaks to these things, Kevin, I think that he draws a lot of that monomyth parallel into his work. And you kind of, Brother Bill was saying this before too, in when we were talking about this, it seems that Manly is saying a lot, but doesn't really say a lot at the same time in this chapter. And I think what he is doing, though, is he's composing a beautiful prose on his approach to understanding what he's been presented and what he's found through his singular lens of his own wisdom.
Mm-hmm. Reverential Ponytail, would you?
Yes, hello. Robert Remington here. Just few things that I had noticed along the way. I put some stuff up in relation to it. For more on the Dervish Sufi correlations, check out Mete Tamicioglu's Livingston Library lecture on a certain sect of dervishes and how they may correlate to how Masons act. The other was in terms of doing, in general, I'm a genealogist amateurishly, but when you're, I think trying to bring the term Noachites in was to not leave out the other two brothers, mainly Ham and Japheth. So it wasn't all descendants of, all in regards to a descendant of Shem. You'll have the same thing, I think, coming later on with those from Isaac and Ishmael. Keep in mind that there were about five other siblings that when somebody says Abrahamic, it's more all encompassing. And I personally was in Syracuse as a kid and experienced the acoustics of Dionysius' ear. I put up a link to it and a picture. Very much like the vaulted ceilings of places like Chartres and so on. My whole thing, as I've been saying for ages, why there is an allusion to the sixth order of architecture has to do with a nod to what I call the medieval roadies, because they really set things up acoustically. Instead of Marshall amps, they had vaulted ceilings to carry the word to the more profane. Same thing, we got into that before about the various elements, and that's where alchemical knowledge would come in terms of, instead of it just being stained glass, it was the chemical composition of that glass that could set a certain mood when the sun hit it. So they're very much well-staged areas. And as you think about it, it took generations for any of these places to be built. You can take a look at St. John the Divine, it's still incomplete. and that's it. That's in our time. So the importance of passing that down, and of course, trade secrets, guilds, so on, just from the simplest form, but in other terms, what the knowledge would do to you, i.e., ending up in the same mess Galileo did if you pointed out things heliocentrically versus terracentrically.
Thank you, brother. I think that's fascinating. That if we
just the last thing was the proportions, and you guys hit it on the head with the Fibonacci sequence. If you have a properly placed altar, it should show that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's fascinating that we talk about creating that sacred space. And that goes back to the idea of what Brother Cliff was saying, that even then within our lodge room, when we have our degrees, we're now forming a temple within a temple to create that space. So great tie into that. Would any of our panelists like to have any closing comments? Brother Cliff, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I enjoyed the conversation greatly, and I don't know during this whole discussion, I was thinking a lot about two other orders actually, the Rosicrucians, probably for obvious reasons, and the Martinists. Maybe one of our discussions can venture into that territory as well.
That'd be fascinating. Brother Joe, any closing comments?
Yeah, no, I'll be super brief. Thank you so much for having me here. I could talk about this for hours, so it's a shame it's only an hour long. But yeah, no, this is great. Thank you for selecting one of my favorite books to talk about, and the discussion was great. So thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you. Brother Jason, any closing thoughts?
I just want to thank all of the brothers who attended this evening for our conversation. I want to thank Brother Cliff for your wisdom, Brother Joe for your insight, Brother Bill for the love that you bring towards this, and our unseen Tyler, Brother RC, for holding us together, and to all you brethren. It's such a gift to be able to get together and explore these ancient mysteries together, to literally travel back into antiquity and blow the dust off of things that aren't talked about as much as maybe some of us would like them to be. So I appreciate all of you, and I love you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. And then our Deputy Grandmaster could not be with us tonight, so I would like to thank him for supporting the Craftsmen online. And then I will just have a couple closing comments. Brother Joe, you had shared a quote, and I want to read that and just reflect on that a little bit. You had said, 100 religions have brought their gifts of wisdom to its altar. Arts and sciences unnumbered have contributed to its Masonic symbolism. And when we talk about that myth of Manly P. Hall, I had that idea of a river, right? We talk about the underground stream or the sacred river. And to that myth is that idea that flowing from the beginning of time, right, has been this current. And then we're challenged that then the imagery that came to me is the idea of the well of the sacred. And that within Masonry, it's just not moral education, but that there's something sacred within it. And then in that well, we have that stream coming forth. And then it's up to us to take our cup, our grail, if you will, and dip it into that and bring it forth. And then we drink from that sacredness, and then that fills us. And then in doing that, though, the challenge is now we have to apply it. Because if we just take it and drink it for ourselves and we don't do anything with it, then it's lost. But for each of us as a Mason, I believe we have an opportunity to drink deep and then use that to transform ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And to use the words of Wilmhurst as living stones of a temple, of a house not made with hands, both in this realm and in the realm beyond. And I think that if we can do that and have that as our aspirational goal, then we not only make our world a better place, but then our influence can transcend beyond even where our eyes can see. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you for coming.